Welcome to this 8th Chats Forum, where we seek to explore the difficult issues of our time with ruthless honesty, openness, respectfulness, and genuine acceptance of diversity of opinion. Homelessness. It's on the TV news pretty much every night, but what do we think? What do we think about it? Well, the Salvos did a survey in 2015 and found that 4 out of 10 people they surveyed considered homeless people to be lazy freeloaders, stupid failures, not working hard enough. 4 out of 10 people surveyed in Australia. So I guess the politicians think that there aren't any votes in it if almost half the population considers homeless people to be bludgers. It's very different to how those 4 out of 10 consider it. If you saw the news last night, you might have seen a small section that dealt with a report by Mission Australia that says there's a rapid increase in the number of working people who are in fact homeless. They've got a steady job, they can't afford their house. Camping out in a park. Our first speaker tonight is Ms. Stacey Northover. Stacey is Executive General Manager for Believe Housing Australia, Anglicare South Australia's nationally accredited community housing provider. Believe Housing provides housing for people in need. So Stacey is in the thick of this issue. Stacey has more than 20 years' experience in various aspects of housing, including tenancy management and property services, where she developed a passion for increasing the supply of and access to affordable housing. Stacey will address the direct interaction between homelessness and housing affordability, how we got where we are, the work Believe Housing does, and broad opportunities for addressing affordability. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ms. Stacey Northover.
So first of all, thank you so much and the warm welcome. It's an absolute pleasure to be here this evening and have the opportunity to talk to you about so many of the important issues that are facing South Australians today. And it's always wonderful to speak alongside Peter as well, who I'm sure will keep you entertained for the rest of the evening. So I have a small video to show you to start with, so let's see if this works. That was a beautiful video that we recently did following the rebrand of our organisation from Anglicare SA Housing to Believe Housing Australia, just for a hope and a fresh outlook on the things that we do. But we are still very much part of Anglicare SA and the housing arm of that organisation. We are, as Peter said, a nationally accredited Tier 1 community housing provider with more than 20 years' experience in delivering safe and secure social and affordable housing and tenancy services. Believe owns more than 2,000 properties and manages them on behalf of the state, and we support around 5,000 tenants across South Australia. We mainly support people on low incomes, including those who have experienced homelessness, young and older people, First Nations people, individuals living with disability and mental health issues, survivors of domestic violence, and people from non-English speaking backgrounds. Being part of the Anglicare SA family means Believe Housing Australia tenants have access to a wide range of support services available to them. I'm going to talk to you first of all about the rent affordability snapshot of this year. Every year, Anglicare Australia tests if it is possible for people on low incomes to rent a home in the private market. This is done by taking a snapshot of properties for rent on realestate.com.au on one weekend in March. We then assess whether each property is affordable and suitable for 14 types of households on low incomes. This slide reveals the key findings. It's a very bleak outlook for South Australia, particularly those young families. Just to highlight a couple of the points, for out-of-work couples with 2 children, just 2 homes, or 0% of the 1,400 listed homes, were appropriate and affordable for those couples. Not a single rental listed was available for a young person on youth allowance. The snapshot showed how hard it is for older people and those living with disability. There are hardly any rental properties available or affordable for anyone on low incomes. A shortage of social and affordable housing means people on low incomes are competing in the same market as private rental as people on higher incomes. As the snapshot shows, they don't stand much of a chance in finding secure, affordable rentals that meet their needs. Even if people on low incomes do manage to secure a rental, it often means going without food, heating, or other basic needs to meet the rising rent cost. We strongly believe everyone should have access to an affordable, safe, secure home as a basic human right. Housing is the largest fixed cost for most low-income Australian households. People have no choice but to pay more than they can afford to keep a roof over their and their families' heads. The rising number of Australians experiencing homelessness shows just how unjust and unsustainable such sacrifices are. Housing costs have been rising much faster than income for decades. At the same time, job seeker and related payments are now so low they trap people in poverty. For more than 20 years, governments have failed to ensure that social security payments have kept up with the cost of living, and that includes housing. The single biggest difference governments can make in addressing poverty and housing insecurity is increasing income support to a level that means people can afford a safe and secure place to live. We are in housing crisis. What we know is housing prices are escalating. Wage and welfare payments are not keeping up. Housing supply continues to be an issue. Over 640,000 Australian households today are in housing stress. The impacts of COVID-19 are just only beginning to be felt, and the cost of living continues to rise. Low-income families, many entering homelessness services, are for the very first time being seen. We also know that job seeker is 57% below the national minimum wage. Policy implications for us to consider is raising job seeker and related payments over the poverty line, and being bold with having a housing vision for South Australia and for the need of more investment. So, what are we doing? Sorry, my notes were mixed up. So the federal government are currently working through a budget and a Housing Australia Future Fund to deliver on 20,000 social homes and 10,000 new rentals over the next 5 years, albeit it's stuck in the Senate at the moment. But without that, we won't meet the demand of today, let alone tomorrow. So what are we doing? Approximately at the moment, we have $40 million worth of homes under construction. Over the next 10 years, we have a $100 million pipeline of developments. Like I've said, we own and manage over 2,000 social and affordable homes, and we have approximately 5,000 tenants who are supported. Believe Housing and Anglicare SA will continue to do research and advocate in this space, and we're currently holding some cross-sector roundtables to discuss solutions. Something that we are extremely proud of, and 2023 for us is a big, big year. In February, we released Believe Place, an $11 million social and affordable housing development in Woodville West. 30 new homes, including 6 villas and 24 apartments. Much needed housing for South Australians, including those who are working and qualify for the affordable housing product. Young people over 55s and people living with disability have moved into these brand new homes, and it is a partnership that we're proud of that we have delivered with the state government. This development was an important investment for the state. Access to affordable housing is crucial and is an issue facing so many South Australians right now. So much to be done over a short and long term to end the housing crisis. We know we need a collaborative approach with community, government and housing sectors working together to end this crisis to become worsening. Housing plays a major fundamental role in health and well-being and providing shelter, safety, security and dignity to people. A person who can't access affordable, secure, appropriate housing experiences several negative consequences that can include homelessness, poor health and lower rates of employment and education. Our new tenants, which include single and families, will be supported to maintain positive constructive tenancies, and this in turn helps to create stronger, safer, sustainable communities. We have 2 further developments due for release towards the end of this calendar year. One is an $11 million development at Panorama, 23 new social and affordable rental apartments, including 8 fully accessible apartments for those living with disability. The Panorama project also includes the sale of 10 new townhouses, offering South Australians more housing options in an increasingly tight market. And a $14 million 37-home development at Mansfield Park, again in partnership with the state government, will also be delivered. The Mansfield Park development, which we are hoping will be completed by the end of this calendar year, everything crossed, is part funded by the returns generated from state government community housing transfers. As a Tier 1 community housing provider, we have the capability and capacity to take on management of public housing transferred by the state to maintain and upgrade housing, support tenants and create communities. We can also reinvest returns from those community housing transfers directly to increase the housing supply in South Australia. This development is just one example. Returns from the state government housing transfers will see us build more than 150 new homes for South Australians in need. Developments like these are an example of many flow-on benefits from community housing transfers. It's a community, business and economic win-win for South Australia. We know construction stimulates jobs and the economy, and we know that people who live in secure housing saves dollars through increased social participation and reduced service use far outweigh the cost of investment. So as I've said, research is a really important aspect to what we do. We have a valuable partnership with the University of South Australia that generates such great research. Research that is evidence-based and that educates and informs us. Effective research allows us to advocate for reforms that ultimately better the lives of South Australians in need. Last year, UniSA and Believe Housing Australia released a research report, Beyond the Housing Crisis, A Home for All. It highlighted the desperate need for new collaborative vision, strategy and action to deal with South Australia's housing crisis, which leaves thousands of people without a home each night. Key points from this research told us that South Australia, like the rest of the country, is in the grip of a housing crisis. Our current system simply can't cope. We need urgent national coordinated response to address the root causes. Rental affordability and availability are at an all-time low across the country. Availability is at its worst in Adelaide, where vacancy rates have hit an all-time low. Responses to this crisis must provide tailored solutions to high-risk cohorts with specific needs, including youth, First Nations people, older people, and people living with disability. Investment in housing for all delivers community-wide social and economic benefits. There is community appetite for change, Survey data shows South Australians feel impacted by the housing crisis and don't think that the government are doing enough. If you're interested in seeing the report, it's on our website. Please go and have a look and look under the tab that says research. Never before has our housing system been under greater scrutiny. There is mounting community pressure to fix the housing market and support for positive change. There are also compelling reasons and opportunities to address this complex issue. We have hosted a series of solution-focused roundtables to collaboratively discuss and devise strategies and actions to increase access to housing in South Australia. So far, we've held 3 roundtables, with all very well attended by around 100 people at each time. In attendance have been key stakeholders from cities and regions, government, not-for-profit and private sector, academia and philanthropy. The roundtables also had the support of people with lived experience who shared their time and their stories. We know we need a whole of community, sector and government approach to end this worsening crisis, and the roundtables are one part of the process. We have partnered with the Community Housing Council of South Australia to produce this roundtable series. We've already held 3 focused on youth housing, housing for over 55s and people living with disability. And the Community Housing Council of South Australia will later this next month host the next roundtable and the last in the series for First Nations. Each roundtable focuses on sharing ideas and learning. It includes international examples, pilot programs, innovation, lived experience voice, barriers, policy considerations, systemic changes needed, and the assessment of multiple solutions. Thank you very much.
Our second speaker tonight is Mr. Peter Sandeman, AM. Many of us know Peter because of Adelaide's famous 2 degrees of separation, and of course because he spoke at our very first forum on the topic of voluntary assisted dying. Peter is the Canon for Social Justice and Advocacy of St Peter's Cathedral Diocese of Adelaide and Cathedral of St Peter and Paul Diocese of Wellockrah. Peter is also the Archdeacon for Social Justice in the Diocese of Murray, where he will be moving the legislation to enable the ordination of women as priests at the special session of the Anglican Synod next month.
And we'll get it up.
Peter is also an adjunct professor in the Centre for Social Innovation at Flinders University and chairs the South Australian Alliance to End Homelessness. Most of you will remember that Peter was the previous CEO of Anglicare South Australia when he retired in December 2020. When not looking after grandchildren, Peter has a part-time role as the Director of Strategic Advice of the SA Housing Authority. In January, Peter was awarded membership of the Order of Australia for service to the Anglican Church and the community of South Australia. Peter will bring us his insights on the homelessness issue as a whole, including its causes, scale and demographics. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Peter Sandeman.
Thanks very much, Peter, and thank you everybody for being here on such a cold night. I'll try and keep you warm, and then after the presentation you can keep me warm by asking me some tricky questions. Alright, so at least, as you heard, I've listed 4 hats I could be wearing for this presentation, but just to make it clear, this is a personal view of the situation, doesn't represent a housing authority policy or a Centre for Social Innovation, social impact viewpoint, or even a South Australian Alliance to End Homelessness viewpoint, or even the ramblings of an ex-CEO. Though it was really good to hear Stacey's presentation. Many of those projects have taken a long time to come to gestation, because one of the sad things is that housing takes an awfully long time to do. So let's have a look at housing and homelessness, AZP and beyond. And AZP stands for the Adelaide Zero Project. Now, let's see if I know the right way to do this. Yes, so just to reiterate, Housing is a human right, and it's clear that housing is often treated as an asset rather than shelter, which is a fundamental need. And more than houses, homes in which lives can be built are crucial to the well-beings of individuals, families of all shapes and sizes, and indeed the whole community. Now, Stacey referred to the state of the rental market with the Anglicare Australia snapshot, and this rather tight table is the South Australian situation. So as you heard, one snapshot weekend each year, Anglicares across the country analyse the state of their local market, and that's fed into a national model. In South Australia, on the 18th of March 2023, 1,456 rentals were advertised for rent in South Australia, and of those, very, very few, indeed 1% of individual properties were suitable for people on the minimum wage, but people who were on benefit, there were none. So it's been like that ever since I remember the snapshot being done. In fact, it's got tighter, it's got worse. So it's not good time to be renting in South Australia. The rental vacancy rate is at a record low, the lowest of all Australian capital cities, and the situation, unfortunately, is that if you lose your rental accommodation, you are stuffed, you are homeless. So I'll come back to that in the presentation. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the reasons for this. Now, this is a slide from the National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation, which is where Anglicare gets its money. Just to answer the question that was there, where do you get your money from? A lot of it comes through NIFIC. NIFIC, the National Housing Finance Investment Corporation, borrows money on the bond market and makes it available to organisations like Believe Housing. Why is that a good thing? Well, banks will lend you maybe for 5 years if you're in a housing company. NIFIC lends for 10. So, and the bond rate, until very recently, has been exceptionally low. So Anglicare got, I can't remember how much money, huge amount of money to do all those projects at a very low rate on long-term bonds. So NIFIC, which the federal government has just allowed them to lift their bond cap by $2 billion in the budget, is a very important organisation. And if you want a very detailed analysis of the housing market, go to their website, and they've just done a state of the market report, and this is a graph from there which really shows that the problem is the rate of formation of households exceeds the building of houses. So we've got an increasing number of households, which is the green line, and the number of houses has actually been underwater for some time. So we're not building enough houses. We're not building enough houses to house people, and there's all sorts of reasons for that. But let me just say, so during COVID, one of the effects of COVID is that we produced many more households, single-person households. People decided they weren't going to share a house with anybody anymore because they were risky. They would live by themselves. And so you've got much more demand for housing simply because of that, something like 100,000 net new households simply because of that factor, let alone immigration, let alone kids growing up and wanting their own houses. So you've got a real challenge there. And I think that was 103,000 households net simply by the impact of COVID, people wanting to move out and live alone. So Stacey talked about some of the figures there. The figures I'm quoting are from NIFIC, which is pretty authoritative. So currently 377,600 households are in housing need, comprising 331,000 households in rental stress. Now, rental stress is when you're spending more than 30% of your disposable income on your housing costs. And there are many households now that are actually spending well over 50% of their disposable income on household costs. And nationally, 46,500 households experiencing homelessness, and that is, if you look at South Australia being 7% of the national population, we used to be 10%, you might remember. That's about 3,255 households experiencing homelessness and 23,000 households in rental stress. So it's here and now. It's a big problem, and there are no easy cures for this. So, Stacey referred to this. Recently, our state government released extra land for housing. Everyone should have a safe and affordable place to call home, said Premier Peter Malinauskas. This residential land release will ensure there is more supply to meet the needs of our growing population now and into the future. We're talking about housing the equivalent of a packed Adelaide Oval. So if you look at what's happening, 10,000 houses, land for 10,000 houses at Dry Creek, 10,000 homes at Concordia, which is out north, and 1,700 homes at Sellex Beach. Of those houses, because it's been state government land, 15% of those houses will be affordable. Now let me explain the difference between affordable and social, because this language is chucked around all the time and it gets very confused because people use affordable when they mean social. Social housing is housing made available on the basis that rent is no more than 30% of your income. And often that is for people on pensions and various forms of government benefit. 30% is the maximum that can be charged. And that's the Housing Trust charges 30%, Believe Housing charges 30%. That's social housing, public housing and community housing, social housing. Affordable housing is if the rent is no more than 75% of the market rent. So affordable housing is usually that earmarked for workers in occupations which need to be located closer to work, nurses, teachers, cleaners, hospitality workers. Otherwise they're going to be out on the fringes, which is where the land that's been released is. So, you know, far be it for me as a good public servant to criticise the government. But this is not an adequate solution. It is the solution we have that's been put forward by our state government. It will be good for those who can buy those houses and live in those houses, but it is really a drop in the ocean. Well, a couple of buckets in the ocean, perhaps. Okay, so let's move along. Okay, so in addition to land supply, we have had public housing announcements, and of course I work for the Housing Trust, so Peter, be careful. So in February the state government released its Better Housing Future Plan. It would stop the sale of 580 public housing properties, and the retention of these properties plus the construction of 564 new homes would mean an additional 1,144 additional public homes in South Australia. And to answer a previous question, some of those are going to be in Mount Barker, Mount Gambier, Murray Bridge, Port Augusta, Port Pirie, Renmark, Whyalla and Williston. And in addition to that, major renovations of 350 existing Housing Trust homes to make them livable again, and updating a further 3,000. Now that's good, but as you can see the numbers are small. Now the significance of not stopping the sale of public housing, you might say, well, what's that all about? Well, governments of both persuasions over the last 30 years have been selling public housing. They've been selling public housing at the rate of something like 400 houses a year. That's not to build new houses, that's to keep the lights on. And as the graph goes down, the number of properties remaining diminishes and the waiting list grows. In fact, the waiting list has grown about as much as the number of houses that have been sold. There's a kind of inverse relationship there. So good on you, Malinauskas government, you've stopped the sale of public housing. That is a really good thing. I tried to get the previous government to stop the sale of public housing. They slowed the sale of public housing, but they didn't stop it. So we're not going to be selling off the farm, but building up the new stock is going to take a long time. So Stacey talked about the HAF, which is the Housing Australia Future Fund. It's a $10 billion fund. It's not quite as it sounds, because that money isn't going to go and buy new houses straight away. It's there to subsidise the running costs of state governments in building new houses. But in any event, it's stuck in the Senate, because the Greens are saying we want a $5 billion expenditure now on housing, and Labor is saying no, we're going to do the HAF, which is equivalent over 5 years to something like 30,000 social and affordable housing. Bearing in mind, social, public and community housing, affordable, 75% of the market rent. So that's the actual situation. We're not going to have a sugar hit for housing unless the Greens have their way. And I don't think they're going to get it. Do you? Do you think the Greens are going to win? Some of you may be optimistic about that. So that's where we're at. I was at a dinner with Mark Butler, the Minister for Health, who's one of our very smart South Australian politicians. I'm a bit of a Mark Butler fan. And he was asked, as Minister of Health, what is your biggest problem? And he said, housing. So there is recognition at the very top. Okay, so what's the situation like for homelessness? So the impact of all of this is pressure on homelessness. People living in the parklands, living on the streets, kids couch surfing, etc., etc. Well, these are the figures. So the top figure is the total, but the red, actual homeless persons known to services. It's an important qualification. These are the people who are known to services. The blue line, is people at risk of experiencing homelessness. They're in insecure or inadequate or temporary accommodation, and they're known to specialist homeless services. This is not an abstract thing. If you go down Glen Osmond Road, go past Hutt Street and look to the right, what do you see? A tent city. We have a tent city on that side, and there's a tent city on the other side. We're no longer immune from this. Adelaide is going to have a growing number of tent cities. So there's some 3,500 homeless people, and the same number of at-risk to homelessness people, roughly 7,000. I think somebody referred to that figure. Oh, Peter did some quick maths, and you were about right, Peter. It's about 7,000 known people. Okay, so let's actually break that down a bit and say, why are people homeless? The red line shows people who are homelessness due to domestic and family violence in red. That's the people, usually single-headed, female-headed families who are experiencing homelessness because of domestic and family violence. Let's have a look at others. People over 65 experiencing homelessness who are known to services, that's the red line. Aboriginal people experiencing homelessness known to services is the green line. Young people 15 to 24 experiencing homelessness are known to services, that's the blue line. And children experiencing homelessness known to services is the purple line. And the trend is up. Now these are the people who are known to services, and I'll come back to that, how that happens in a little while. And for those who'd like to know the breakdown by gender, our stereotype of homeless people being older men sleeping rough, the actual figures show the opposite. There's more women than men who are homeless. So in March this year, known to services, there were 4,261 female persons experiencing homelessness and 2,570 males. The gender differences were most marked for the years 15 to 55, before and after which the numbers are roughly even. But that age, 15 to 55, the majority of homeless people are women. And that's actually not the expectation most of us would have. So what are we doing about it? There is some good news. The Australian Alliance in Homelessness is a campaign run by a national collection of communities and organisations committed to ending all homelessness, starting with rough sleeping. And to do that, they engage and work with and train local communities to know the people who are rough sleeping in their communities by name. So a by name list is formed and people are known by name and their needs are assessed and their what they want is assessed. I used to hear the language of, those people are just service resistant. They won't take the services that are offered. Thankfully, I hear that a lot less now. What we now try and do is make the services fit the people, not the people fit the services. And it's a bit more successful. Working with communities to produce the quality data through the by name list to track progress, and I'll show you the graph in a minute, to see if you are successfully housing people, to line up supply of housing to match people to the services they require, to move people into the housing and help them to stay housed, and to ensure, this is the aim, rough sleeping is rare, brief and non-reoccurring. So the Advance to Zero campaign uses this methodology developed over many years by the various partners of the Australian Alliance to End Homelessness across Australia and internationally. And the work is internationally is coordinated by Community Solutions, and some of you will remember Roseanne Haggerty, who was a speaker in residence not so long ago, and the Institute of Global Homelessness and the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. Now, the first Advance to Zero project in Australia was the Adelaide Zero project. Adelaide was named as the first vanguard city by the Institute of Global Homelessness. So a lot of the work that is now happening across Australia began here in Adelaide through the Adelaide Zero project, which I was very privileged to co-chair. It's a collective impact approach to tackling street homelessness in the CBD and surrounding parklands to achieve what is called functional zero. Functional zero is when you have more houses and more support services over a 3-month period than you have people becoming homeless. If you measure absolute zero, then somebody becomes homeless, you failed, but functional zero is when you have more of the necessary resources than you have homeless people. So able to house them and support them. That's the aim. And it's a worldwide methodology adopted through the Institute of Global Homelessness. Institute of Global Homelessness is actually highly sponsored by DePaul International and has its headquarters in DePaul University, Chicago. And when I went there, I suddenly realised I'd fallen among Catholics. So it's good Catholic social justice teaching. It really is. The Adelaide Zero project was initiated by a group of non-government CEOs using the Advance to Zero methodology with the support of the Don Dunstan Foundation acting as the backbone organisation. So collective impact is a form of community work which has 5 key attributes. It's about people working together with a common cause, a common agenda, a shared measurement of how well you're doing, mutually reinforcing activities so you keep working together, lots of communication and a backbone support organisation. So it's very much evidence-led practice. The Don Dunstan Foundation was the initial backbone organisation, and now we have the Australian Alliance to End Homelessness. So, if you go and look at Adelaide Zero project, you'll find this graph, which is the number of people sleeping rough and the number of people supported, and that's varied over time. So you can see then when the bars have raised up and the golden bars are very prominent, that was during COVID. And we had the commitment by the state government to house everybody on the street. Why? Because they were dangerous. They could infect everybody. So we mobilised the resources and we nearly ended street homelessness in Adelaide and South Australia. We got very close. So in some ways, homelessness is a political choice. It's a decision as to how we use the resources. I won't go into the details of that, but if you want to accost me afterwards, I can tell you the gospel of the Zero project ad infinitum. So we've built on the Zero project and we have created 5 homelessness alliances. So a collective impact approach has been adopted. It was adopted by the previous government and has been reinforced by this government. And essentially 5 homelessness alliances have been formed. So instead of agencies doing their own thing and having some kind of occasional collaboration, they are funded together and they have to collaborate and work as a solid group. And we have the Towards Home Alliance, which is this area, Adelaide South, the Adelaide Northwest Alliance, the Port and Northern Suburbs, the Country North Alliance, the Country South Alliance, and the Domestic and Family Violence Alliance. So these alliances use a collective impact methodology, to work together to actually identify, to support, and to enable people not to be homeless. So how well are we doing? And this is a graph modelling the functional zero for the Adelaide Zero project. And the red line is where we're up to in terms of numbers of homeless people, and the dotted lines are projections to try and predict when we can actually achieve functional zero. In essence, the flow into homelessness tends to be approximately, in the Adelaide CBD, tends to be approximately 41 new people experiencing street homelessness every month. The algorithm assumes 23 houses per month are made available, 20 by the Housing Authority and 3 by the community housing providers like Believe Housing. It also assumes a 2% reduction in the inflow each month, and with 12.5% of the people on the by name list becoming inactive. Because what tends to happen, people become homeless and some of them get supported through the formal structures and others find their own way. And some just disappear. And because we haven't got a statewide by name list at the moment, it's hard to track. We're getting there, but at the moment people can just disappear. And look, frankly, a lot of people who are homeless don't really like attention from the authorities at all. So I'll talk about that a little further in a minute, but I'll just talk about another reform that's going through right at the moment, which is the review of the Emergency Accommodation Program, which actually I'm involved in my role with Housing Trust at the moment. So originally conceived as a stopgap measure, EAP puts people into hotels and motels if they're homeless. It's a very expensive form of assistance, and because the average length of stay has increased vastly, it means families are often in very inappropriate accommodation. And it disrupts lifestyle because the way the scheme is administered, you only get 1 or 3 or 7 nights approval, and then you have to apply again, all that kind of stuff. So what are we trying to do? We're trying to actually do 2 things. Slow the flow into homelessness. How do we slow the flow into homelessness? Well, we spoke earlier about if you lose your private rental tenancy at the moment, you really are stuffed because there's very few vacancies. So you go from having a family home to nothing in the space of, well, overnight for some people. So I'm working with the Real Estate Institute so that we can identify the families who are actually struggling to actually pay their rent, or there are other issues in their lives that are causing them to be in danger of losing their tenancy, and to provide support then and there, including some brokerage funds. Those discussions are starting to work, but there's still a lot of water to go under the bridge. But if we can slow the flow into homelessness, then our overstretched homelessness services have a decent chance of actually being able to do their job. And the other opportunity we have is to actually better utilise what is known as hard-to-let housing authority stock and other underutilised facilities, as was mentioned earlier, to secure apartments rather than hotel rooms. So that reform is going through at the moment, but there are a couple of major gaps, and one of which is the lack of supported accommodation options for people who need ongoing support. They're not eligible perhaps for the NDIS, but they need ongoing support, and as you probably are aware, boarding houses have largely disappeared. So where do these people go? So the issue really, though, is for us to understand that Although we might regard housing as a human right, the necessary funding for affordable and social housing isn't there. One of the issues really is if you need subsidised housing, you need a subsidy. And federal and state governments over the years haven't been doing it. In fact, our state government's been selling the very precious public housing stock. They've stopped now, but well over 20,000 houses were sold. We used to have, in the heyday of the Housing Trust, the most public housing available across Australia was here. Successive governments thought that was a wasted asset and sold it. It actually wasn't a wasted asset. It was a fundamental underpinning of the housing supply, and therefore people could be supported and not become homeless. Anyhow, any questions?